So I hope you enjoyed this short break and everybody got a drink and everybody is back to focus again. I want to, in this panel, discuss two topics that I actually, as recruiting many engineering managers and speaking to them, I came across. And then afterwards, I want to give the stage to yourself. If you have any questions specifically to one speaker or to all the speakers. And what we try to do here is also to start a small discussion. So come with your difficult questions and let them sweat a bit. The first topic that also was in your talk also in the end is that some people have the notion that an engineering manager always needs to be a great engineer. And I wanted to ask actually all three of you, to what extent you think that an engineering manager needs to be a great engineer, or is it a totally different skill set? Who wants to start?
I probably won't be, well, I don't know, I might be controversial here. You've got to be able to hold people to account for what they're doing. And that means you have to have enough knowledge to do that. So some people think that the best engineering managers are people that are only 2 or 3 years away from actually writing production code. I don't think that's necessarily true. You can kind of keep up to date. But if you don't know what you're being told, or you don't have that conceptual framework to understand it, how are you ever going to ask the right questions? And I think that's actually your job technically as an engineering manager, is to ask the right questions to tease out the detail from people. But yeah, that's probably not too controversial, but.
Yeah, I tend to agree with you, first of all. I think that in theory, the answer could be no. I think the reality is different. Mm-hmm. I think you do need to understand. So if you're not a great engineer, you can still be an engineering manager, but then you need to be curious. You need to actually understand what your teams are working on. I think you're right. It's very hard to ask the right questions. And I think it's very hard to be a credible engineering manager if you don't know what you're talking about. So unless, I mean, some companies probably have engineering managers only doing the people management side of things. So in that case, maybe it's less relevant, but I don't know how many companies do that. So in my experience, it would be impossible to be not technical, I think. But yeah. Cool.
Well, I think I completely agree with Andrew and Andrew. Just what I would add is you have to be a good engineer and not a great engineer. You don't have to always know the solution. Because if you always know the solution, then what are the other engineers doing there? So there's very little point in having a team around, right? You have to be a good critic. That's what you have to be good at. So that mindset is absolutely necessary.
Yeah, cool. Okay, clear. Here, and also you must be interviewing a lot of engineering managers yourself. So I wanted to ask what your favorite interview question is if you're interviewing with engineering managers to unravel if this is the right person for the job.
Yeah, I always ask the engineering managers, so let's say now a fire drill starts, who are you going to evacuate first?
What is a good answer to that?
The correct answer is the whiteboard.
So first of all, I have a bunch of favorite questions. And what's fun is that I actually do say, this is one of my favorite questions when I interview people. I guess I'll mention one of them. As I said, I'm quite passionate about feedback. So one of my favorite questions is, tell me about the best feedback you've ever received and how you acted on it, etc. Then you can explore a bit more.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what was a good answer to that as well, that you remember?
Well, there isn't a good answer. I think it's more about understanding how they approach feedback, what's their mindset. I guess it's a different version of the question about your weaknesses. But yeah, I think it's more to understand their mindset, really. Understand their approach to failure, their approach to welcome other people's opinions and stuff like that.
I'm going to go very sort of meta, and mine's not really a question, so it's something I look for when I'm talking to people in an interview. And as Andrea alluded to, one of the best ways to bring a team together is to build trust in individuals. And the best way to build trust quickly, almost counterintuitively, is to be vulnerable. And one of the best ways to be vulnerable is to share something about yourself that's a little bit personal. And so if I notice during an interview that this person is beginning to tell me things about themselves that are quite personal, they give me an idea of who that person is, and I'm beginning to trust them a little bit more. That to me is such a telltale sign that this person knows how to build good teams because they're doing it to me. It's not manipulative. It's just, it's good. It's good. It's a good way of doing stuff. It's less a question and more just part of the conversation.
Yeah. And how do you get that out of people then?
I think it's something that you start at a very high level, maybe technical, you talk about work, you talk about the job that you're interviewing for, and then you begin to dive into ways of doing things, and then always try and leave things open-ended. Never go for those yes/no questions, because you never give them the space then to talk about sort of continuing on from things there. And then try and see how they felt about certain situations. So if you're talking about feedback, for example, if you had some tough feedback, well, how did it make you feel at the end of it? How did you come back from that? How did you regain your confidence? That sort of thing.
Yeah. Nice, sounds good. Cool. Are there any questions from the audience that you would like to ask the speakers?
So I once found myself managing a team and I had no business managing that group of people. One of those people was, let's call him difficult to be nice. Contract employee, somebody that was hired before I took over the team, had a very significant contribution to the project. And yeah, let's go back to calling him nice, not necessarily a team player. What's the sort of scenarios you've seen, and how have you dealt with those situations?
Sure, I'll kick off. The worst case I ever had wasn't in engineering. It was my first role as a manager in the army, and I had a soldier who ended up in court 3 times. He had crashed a car that he was driving without a license. He had all sorts of personal issues going on. He had debt collectors coming along to sort of camp. So I think it's that sort of thing. And for some reason, I was responsible for this individual. And the things I learned very quickly were process, unfortunately, is your number one. You need to get to know your HR team. You need to get to know the people who will tell you about employment law, and do that early. That's the first thing you need to do. Arm yourself with knowledge, and it gives you the options, because there will be so many. If you don't follow that process, you have no option at the end of the day to deal with someone who's not performing well. The flip side of it is that you should always give that person the opportunity to correct. So there may be reasons that all of this stuff is going wrong. Feedback, best way to do that. But always make sure you cover yourself by understanding the process and making sure you've followed it from the get-go, because that will save you so much time.
How do you know how much to follow from the process? Because you're still dealing with people, right? So how do you find a balance as a manager?
I think the balance is you always start with feedback. See if they can self-correct. See if you can change the situation for them. But you always have to be aware. The thing about process is that if the situation's bad, you'll always get to that process. But if you haven't started there, the situation will drag on much further, and it's much more likely to impact other people in the team. That's my sort of general finding, and that's the really sad time.
Yeah.
So I think the first thing is, to find out, like Andrew said, why this is happening. So if you can actually help them, so don't immediately tell them you're upset, for example, but try to understand why they're doing what they're doing. I think once you understand, I think it's important to make them realize the impact that their behaviors are generating on other people. And then it's important to clarify the expectations. So if there is, I think the process is very useful, actually, even if it's tough. But it's important to clarify the expectations and set goals and a specific time frame for them to try to make up, and then use the process as a tool for you to be able to do something. But I think first, of course, you have to try to help them to perform better. I think it's important to make it more about their behaviors rather than criticizing them as people. That's super important. And also it's important to, again, to explain the impact and to provide examples. If you're too generic, the feedback won't really land well.
I think they covered pretty much everything.
Yeah. Anything to add?
Yes, I definitely start with getting to know the person, but assuming the person is very hard to be nice to, or they're not being nice to you, they're obviously having drinks with the person. But you can definitely find what makes them tick. That's the important bit there. And then feedback loop starts. It's a personality thing, right? Personalities, they'll take months to change, 6 months even, right? Process is the last option, last resort. I mean, your kid is misbehaving. You're not going to just straight away slap them or put them in the naughty corner or anything, right? You're just going to talk to them first. So yeah, talk to them, and then you obviously have tools like HR at your hand. But yes, last resort. If you can't figure out anything, they may be happy with a different team, because you might figure out that, hey, a person is best retained maybe in a different team than your own, if you don't want to let go of them immediately.
Cool, thanks. Does it answer your question? It helps. Nice. Any more question?
Thank you for your talks. Perhaps starting the question for Andrew, that we talk a lot about like direct reports and a little bit less with direction with your managers. How about the peers? Because now friendly circle should be a little bit big, because if you need to spot a new spot for someone that is in your team that may have another opportunity, there's much interaction there. Could you tell us a little bit more how you handle interaction with your other peers, for instance? Or
yeah, I'd say that's something I came relatively late to the party to learning. It's very easy to get myopic. Think about your boss, think about your team, focus on your stakeholders. That's great. And one thing that I think none of us have touched on is that being a leader is a lonely position. So where do you get your support from? Because your boss is ultimately your boss. He's not your friend. He, as friendly as you can be friendly, but it's not a good relationship to have with people in that sort of position because of the power dynamic. So the people you really get support from are your peers, and that can be difficult because you're all busy. So I'd say that good things that have worked for us here are having lunches together, making sure that we do things on a regular cadence, and every once in a while having an offsite where you get in a room and share awful things about your past with each other. It's always a good way. But yeah, I'd say something I learned late that's massively important.
I mean, my answer is actually very similar, because we are in a similar situation. We have regular meetings, we have fortnightly lunch, we have sometimes offsites. I personally believe that in my specific case, there is a lot of room for improvement with my peers. I believe that we basically face similar challenges every day, and we probably go about solving them in very different ways, which is fine. But I think we could support each other way more because we really understand what we're going through. And I'm actually trying to push my peers to have more of this, create more trust within our team. I spoke about trust and vulnerability, and I think I was talking mostly about the teams I manage, which I'm really proud about. But I'm not as happy with the team of engineering managers because I think there could be way more trust. So I think this is sometimes it's actually neglected I actually agree 100% with what you said.
It becomes a very difficult position as you keep going towards the center, because you don't have many peers. So when you reach a head of engineering position, you're the only one. And at that point, what you look for is that last little hug from your kid. I'm going to keep coming back to that analogy. You look for acceptance from the people who are reporting into you. And if they've accepted you, you probably just don't need any other support after that.
But who do you go to then for information and knowledge as well outside of the company, possibly?
You definitely have network outside of the company, definitely. For example, events like this, or events for CTOs or at that level, or just in general, other events, right? You've got books and stuff and other people you network with. But for support, so believe me, when you ask one of the people who's reporting into you who can solve your problem, you'll be the happiest. It's like a kid beating you in chess, right? So it's the best feeling that you'll ever have.
So mine is a very quick question and ties into what you just said. When I mean directions, I'm talking about organigram type of thing. Going down, you require a lot of empathy. Going up, a little bit more professional than human. How can you shield yourself from being pulled too much on the business side of things compared to the very needed human side of things of the managerial role?
Okay, I'm just going to start because I'm holding the mic. So drawing a parallel again from my analogy, I'm trying to think. So the best I can think of it, and by the way, I don't have any kids. I've just been bullshitting about kids. Is like if my wife, so my wife's pretty strict, right? That'll be like shielding my kids from my wife, like the expectations. So that's exactly what I'd be doing with my kids. I'll be like, yeah, all cuddly, and with my wife, like, yeah, he's okay, that's fine. So that's the kind of thing you'll have to do. When you've been in and out of meetings or in that zone for a bit, you'll see that if you have to walk out of a meeting room where you are with your team, where you are more mushy, and then you have to walk immediately into a team where you got the C-level people, your posture, your mindset will automatically change. And as I said, nobody can teach you this. It just automatically comes to you. And these things are like, you'll realize soon enough, okay, fine, I did that, but did I do that consciously? Probably no. It just happens. With practice, it just comes in. And you're like, so that's the person I want to talk to in a more friendly way. I need to know them better. Right. So that's what you start thinking about instead of just saying that, oh, they're at that particular position. So I need to have a suit up. Right. I talk to my CEO in a very friendly way. But that's after like 6 months of working with him.
So I believe what you described is a very typical pattern that it's quite easy to fall into. I believe if you focus on the outcome, so if you're talking about the business side of things, if you focus on what you're trying to achieve, if you forget about the people side of things, ultimately you're not going to achieve your outcomes. So I think it's something that sometimes it's easy to forget about that side of things, but you have to force yourself to always remind yourself really that you have to do that. I think as engineering managers or leaders in general, we also act as filters. So sometimes we have a lot of pressure on ourselves. And if we just let all the pressure go down to our direct reports, that's not gonna do good. So I think it's important, again, that's why I'm quite passionate about emotional self-awareness as well. If you do understand what you're going through, then you're more likely to understand what's good to pass on to your teams and what's important to actually filter and just keep for yourself. So.
I couldn't agree more with what's been said. Maybe I'll add, how do you get good at sort of doing that sort of thing? So some different things I've heard, which are a little bit whack and a bit out there, is that one of the things you should do as a manager is look to acquire tool sets in the same way that you would as an engineer. So learn new tools, see how other people do things. For example, an interesting piece of advice I once heard is, if you get angry about once in a year, it's really interesting to see the effect it has on all the people you work with. Because if you never get angry and suddenly you're angry, you'll see a step change in the room. That's a little tool set. I'm rubbish at it. So I find it very, very, very intrinsically difficult to do. And I was talking to a friend of mine who works not in technology at all, works in consulting, and they all get sent on an acting course, which sounds nuts. But the point is to try and get you outside of your own head of, oh, I'm not this person, I can't do it. Learn to do different things. Just give it a try. And sometimes you'll be amazed to see the results. And it can really help with situations like that.
Thank you.
Hi, guys. I've got kind of a similar question to this chap over here, but maybe on the other side of things. So how do you approach dealing with software engineers who are quite quiet and having an ongoing relationship, trying to find out how their teams are doing? And maybe another secondary part of that question is, how do you manage a team of quiet engineers, or start a team where all the engineers are quiet? What's your approach?
I guess we have to define what quiet means, first of all. But I think that's also, lots of engineers are quite introverts. And I think depending on the company that you're working for, sometimes that just doesn't fit. Like sometimes you can't really have a team where everyone is quiet. So I think it's okay to have diversity in a team, that you have some extroverts, some introverts, that's okay. I think the way I would approach that, or I approach that, is more to understand what these people are after. What is their passion? Why did they become an engineer in the first place? What brought them where they are? And what is their ultimate goal? Like, how do they see themselves in 2 to 5 years, for example? What skill set do they need? Do they need to learn more technologies, or do they need to learn some soft skills? So that's the way you can help them to start building a vision for themselves and to come out of their shell, I think. I think at the end of the day, in some companies, it might be looked as a bad thing. It doesn't necessarily have to be. I think quiet engineers can be valuable for other reasons.
No, that's I think the best remedy is time. Most of the time, I've found that quiet engineers are quiet until you find the right thing to talk to them about, and that can either be because you've been with them long enough that you've suddenly given them an opportunity that's big enough that they have to talk to you. It's their job, and suddenly you're talking to solve problems. Or it can be that one day. Actually, he's left now. But one of the engineers here, we kind of had, he was here earlier, we were having our one-to-ones, and there was a moment where we just started talking about the fact that he plays a lot of bridge. And 45 minutes later, still going. It was great. It's really good. Yeah, I'd say time. Yeah, and look for those things.
Quiet is sometimes you'll feel quiet is good. You'll get an engineer at some point where you feel like, oh, that quieter engineer was definitely good. How I deal with it, if you do get a team of quiet engineers, like everyone is like that, I split and grow the teams. Because I do want diversity in the team. Personality is a very good focus for diversity as well. It's not just gender diversity or something, right? Personalities need to be diverse because that's how you'll get to great solutions. But then again, time is what will make them tick. Everyone is motivated by something. They just need to know how to talk enough. They don't have to really go into the banter side of things. Some people are extroverts, so they can just talk about anything. Like I can probably go on about anything. But some people are very introverted and they would just talk to the point. And that's absolutely fine. I mean, there's nothing wrong about it. For my senior engineer, for example, I just need that they, talk to other senior engineers across the tribes. And that's all. I don't need them to be laughing all day or cracking jokes all day. So that's absolutely perfect.
Cool, thank you. Any more questions?
Hello, good evening. Thank you for your talks. I'd like to ask you about the balance, the right balance, to make your engineers accountable without being too disciplinarian. I mean, we had maybe, say, 50 years ago, the very strict boss that's inspired by fear, and I think that's not the way we're going here, not the way that I expect we would like to go. But on the other extreme, we can have people being too comfortable and not going far enough with what they're doing. So how do you go to them and tell them, yeah, you're doing a good job, but not good enough?
I feel like you guys started. I think it all comes down to clear expectations. I think I've seen in the past a lot of companies fail actually at setting clear expectations. Depending what the role is, setting clear expectations is the best way to then hold people into account. And of course, it's not just the expectations. You also need a system, like some sort of structure to then that you can use to then actually hold people accountable. And this has also to be related with their personal growth. Like if you're trying to help them to get to the next level, to be promoted or to change job, whatever they're trying to do, I think that's also something that you need to do. You need to set specific goals according to the expectations to help them do that. And I mean, eventually, when you hold people accountable, you don't want to use blame, but if you have set clear expectations, you can afford doing that. Not blaming, but hold people accountable.
One thing that I've learned over the time that I've managed different types of engineers and engineering managers is punishing is never the right way. So that's totally out of the question. They have to realize that they will not be punished for making a mistake. They have to be free enough to be able to make a mistake, but then you have to help them realize that they're accountable for fixing that mistake. Right. So clear expectations definitely is the biggest thing. I don't believe too much in setting objectives, but you just have to make it clear, like what is expected at your particular level. Right. There are different levels of engineers, and an entry level engineer would have very different expectations. A senior engineer will have different. So you just have to make sure they understand what's required of them. Sometimes they will falter and they will not perform at the level. That's when you have that conversation, one-to-one, or when you talk about like, okay, what happened and what do you think should have happened? Everyone is smart. I mean, they're an engineer, they know they've got that human factor. So you just fill in the little gaps in there. That's it. As a manager, your position is not to dictate what to do. It's to bring out that capability in that person to feel what's the right thing to do.
I'll go super specific for it. So how do I handle dates? How do I handle when we need to deliver something? And how do I guess instill accountability for that? But because it's one of the trickiest problems in what we do. And I guess at the very beginning, we'll use a forecast. Right? We'll have an idea of roughly when we might land, but I won't hold anyone accountable for that. My job's to communicate that will change. What I try and do is I make sure that the person is comfortable with the data we're using, that they gain confidence that the forecast we're using is relatively accurate. And then there's a certain point in time where, as with all work, work will sort of expand to fit the time you've got left. But at a certain point, I'll look to sit down with the tech lead or the team, the people that are actually going to be doing the work, and ask them, given this forecast that we've built together, this idea of how long we think this will take, and it's saying this, do we think we can commit to that? And what are the caveats to that? And once we've had that conversation, what I've got from them is essentially a commitment. And my job's then to hold them accountable to that. And I'm not looking for them to hit it necessarily, but I'm looking to them to take on the same level of responsibility that I have for the delivery. And at that point, I've got their back. If it doesn't go wrong, if it doesn't go right. Sorry, Freudian slip there. But
does it answer your question?
Hi. When forming a new team and you discover that it's not going well, they're not bonding, or they're not getting on through maybe personality clashes or something similar, how do you go about debugging that or fixing that?
I'd say my first step is always to look for opportunities outside of the team. So what's the landscape that I have to play with? Then I would always there will probably be a number of things. There's never just, one thing or one individual. There's probably some things going on. It might be one individual, but then I think you've got more of a case of what you were talking about earlier. I find it's good to bundle large numbers of change in a particular event or time and use it as I guess almost communicate it as a step forward rather than a change or a step back. And to be maybe a bit more concrete about that, if you have other opportunities available to you, so say other teams that these people could work in, reconfiguring things, you admit that things were going okay, but not working in certain areas, and you look to solve them by making a step change towards a better model. That's usually my approach, but I think it often comes down to specifics.
I think the way you debug, like you said, I think comes down to talking to people to understand where the issues lie. I think in my experience, usually it's good advice to usually start with trust, like I mentioned before. So what I did in the past was workshops with the teams to start understanding, to like getting to know each other and starting to create more trust within the team. I think that's usually a common issue, that people actually don't get along because they don't really trust each other. Then obviously that doesn't necessarily solve the issue. Sometimes the solution is maybe there is a troublesome individual that you have to look after. Maybe you have to either move them to another team or do something different. So I think it really depends on situations, but my experience is trust is the first thing to look into usually.
What do you do if your kids are fighting? I mean, you don't replace your kids. You have to find what the source is. Sometimes it's very hard, but one thing is for sure, as a manager, if I've got that team that I'm building and it's not coming together pretty nicely, I've made a mistake somewhere. I've missed something, so that's some retrospective for myself. And then just focus on the team, like individual personalities. Probably there's something that's just not taken very well between the various engineers. And there are then different tools available to you, like take them out, team building activities, all the stupid things like your personality tests and stuff. They're never personally useful, but they at least lock you down in a room, and then you can't go anywhere, right? You have to talk to each other. So there are many tools available on that sense, but you'll have to talk to them. Your worst case scenario is you just split the team, but it usually never comes down to that. It's never that serious.
Just be the kids.
Yeah. One of them sleeps with the mom, the other one with the dad.
Okay, thank you. One last question we'll do, and afterwards we'll also, as a speaker, to stay a bit longer for some drinks, so you can also ask some personal questions there. Yeah, 2 more questions I see, so let's do 2.
Hey guys, sorry. We've touched a lot about dysfunctional teams tonight and underperforming teams. How, to flip that on its head, how do you go about managing teams that are very high performant? 1, how do you add value to them? And 2, how do you deal with the situation where they come to you and you don't know the answer? How do you still give them what they're looking for?
Good question.
I would say my experience has been so far that whenever you're getting close to that, there's always a bigger fire going on somewhere else, and someone wants a piece of your team. I think you touched on some interesting things, though. Part of my job that I think I'm meant to do, that I've sort of defined, is that I look for opportunities for people to progress. And I think if a team is performing fantastically, firing on all cylinders, and I no longer provide any help for them in what they're doing, awesome, I can chill out. But they're probably going to plateau at some point. So I desperately need to find tougher, harder problems for them to solve on their own, to help them grow, basically, because we're all on a bit of a journey. And if they've reached that point, fantastic. What's the next step? So that's my sort of 2 cents, I guess.
Yeah, I was going to say something similar. I said if they're performing so well, I think you've probably not set the bar high enough. I feel like you have to challenge them more. You have to find their next challenge. Yeah. And in terms of the other question is, what do you do if when you don't know the answer? So as I said during my speech, that's perfectly fine. I think what's important is that you give them the right piece of advice. You know how to help them to look for the answer somewhere else, so you can help them to go to the right people. It's okay to admit that you don't know something, but you can still unblock them, and help them to find the answer somewhere else.
So I like the question because this is where the analogy doesn't work. So there are two things, and someone told me like there's a moment until when you are a god to your kid, right? When they come in, so they're trusting everything that you're telling them, right? Whatever you say, they just trust you. There's a moment when they come in and they ask you a question that you don't know the answer to, right? Like my nephew came in the other day and he asked me, Uncle, can you explain to me what does this word mean? It says sarcasm. And there was a split-second pause there. And that pause was enough to shatter my image in his brain. I was no longer the god. So I was a person who did not know something. And that's when I had to quickly think like, okay, fine, I don't know this. How do I act in front of him? So that's where it gets different for engineers, because there already is an expectation set that you won't know everything. From the first question here, like, you don't have to be a great engineer. You only have to be a good engineer. So yes, there will be things you don't know. The second thing is, if your team is really that high performing, which some teams do become after some time, they've got that synergy, then you've made yourself redundant in that team, and it's time for you to definitely grow and move on. And that's something you should definitely explore. If there is some other team you can add the same amount of value to. And that team, again, so I'll take that point from Andrew, should be progressing up. Like someone could become the new people leader for that team.
I just want to add one thing we didn't say is, first of all, give them praise, because that's important. Recognize that they're doing well. Never forget it.
Nice. Next question.
So when you have a few engineers where you know they're good, or at least you can see that they could be quite good, but maybe due to past experiences, or maybe they haven't seen the way forward, how do you encourage them to, I guess, go to the right path to go to the next level? And the point is, like, they have a couple of blocks in front of them that either they have put in front of them, or like past experiences they have learned in a bad way, I guess, how to deal with things. How do you encourage them to have the right behaviors and move to the next step without like being afraid, or without having these blocks in front of them?
So I think, as I said at the beginning, in a previous question actually, I think the first thing is to understand what their next step actually is, because it's not, I mean, we take for granted that someone who's a software engineer wants to become a senior and then something else. And I think taking that for granted is not necessarily the right thing to do, because different people can have different career aspirations. Then I think it's important to understand why they feel blocked. So that could be, for example, lack of clear expectations, like we said before. And I think what's important is that as engineering managers, we don't necessarily want to provide them with a perfect solution, but I think it's important what we coach them and help them to think for themselves. Most likely, if they have a problem, they also have the solution. So I think sometimes we have to listen very carefully without interruption, and probably at some point asking the right questions will lead them to the right answer as well.
Good.
I think the most useful tool for getting people over blocks that they've put in their own way, if it is the way they want to go. So if you're sort of taking the steps that Andrew has talked about, is I guess almost what I'd describe as, I'm going to steal your analogy here, is, you know, holding someone's hand while you sort of take them forward. To me, it's mentoring before you move to coaching. So bring them with you. Get them to do. Say for example, because we're talking about moving from engineer to engineering manager here. If that's the route that they want to go, but they have, maybe they've experienced management before and they hated it. Include them in some things. Take them with you. Ask them to pick up small tasks, but really, really be there to make sure it goes well. And just, almost breadcrumbs, sort of bigger and bigger steps. And then you get to a certain point at which they're already doing the thing. And that's when you can switch to a coaching role to get them to the point where they realize that they're doing the thing that they've already said they wouldn't do again.
I was just thinking when you guys were talking, and that gave me some more time to think about it, because these are really difficult situations, right? I mean, it's easier for us to give an answer in 10 seconds instead of actually doing it. So there are two types of situations that could be in the case that you mentioned. One, the person is actually worthy of that progression, maybe in some time. You see it, they're just struggling to get there. The other is the person has really struggled, they want to progress, and they're not capable of that progression, because if you just promote them, they'll be set up for failure and they'll be failing up even harder, right? So the first one is easier to solve because you work with them, you give them more challenges. They can break those challenges with some mentoring, all right? They probably don't get to the point of coaching. The second one is where you have to directly talk to them and then maybe set some lower level goals, right? Some baby steps. And then once they pick up the speed, that's when you can start talking to them like, okay, now you're on your way that, yes, you can actually progress as a natural engineer, maybe senior engineer, engineering manager, or principal engineer, or whatever. But you may have to kickstart an engine differently, right? Every engine is very every engine is very different. So it may just need a different type of fuel.
Cool, thank you so much. Yeah, and then I want to wrap up the talks, and thank you, Ash, Andrea, and Andrew for speaking today and answering all these questions on stage, and thank you all for coming today and also asking great questions here. Give a big round of applause. So it was a kickoff of Talking Talent in London, and we are on Eventbrite, and you can follow for many more events to come as well. And you also, because you signed up, you also sort of will get a newsletter that if you don't want it, you can opt out on, but a newsletter on what the next event is going to be about. So I hope to see you soon during the next event. And then only the last thing that I wanted to say is to thank Funding Circle for hosting us today and using their amazing space. Thank you.